gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. The use of crowdsourcing for posting bail has long been scrutinized by courts as a way to disguise the true source of funds. Crowdsourcing for bail has been seen, at least to one scholar, as, quote, an easy way to legitimize money, which would have otherwise been rejected by the court due to its likely being the proceeds of criminal activity. That's because if there is little or no relationship between the defendant and those supplying the money, the bail money provides no incentive to prevent the defendant from simply fleeing the jurisdiction. This is especially true if the money does not have to be paid back. But while crowdsourcing funds is generally illegal, the use of charitable bail funds remains legal in most states. Charitable bail funds generally flew under the radar until 2020, when the George Floyd riots caused revenues to balloon, thanks to solicitations from celebrities and politicians, including then Senator Kamala Harris. What used to be small, community-based organizations that helped post bail for nonviolent misdemeanors has now grown into a multi-million-dollar industry. For example, the Minnesota Freedom Fund saw revenues increase by 18,000% between 2019 and 2020. Similarly, the Bail Project saw its contributions triple in 2020 to nearly $42 million. These funds are nearly indistinguishable from crowdsourcing websites. There's no relationship to the defendant. The donations come with little to no scrutiny, and there's no guarantee that the money would have to be paid back. Perhaps more alarming, what was intended to help bail out low-level, nonviolent protesters has instead been used to release violent felony offenders back into the streets with little to no oversight. In 2021, for example, the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which then Senator Harris actively promoted, released a domestic abuser back onto the street. 2 weeks later, that man, George Howard, was charged with second-degree murder for a road rage incident. Michael DeWitt of Louisville, Kentucky, was bailed out by a bail project in February of 2021 after being arrested on multiple charges. 2 months later, he was arrested for murder. Sean Michael Tillman, 3 weeks after having his bail paid by the Minnesota Freedom Fund, murdered a man at a light rail station in St. Paul and is now serving a life sentence for that crime. Mr. Chairman, the list goes on and on. According to an investigation conducted by CNN in Hennepin County, Minnesota, the Minnesota Freedom Fund has bailed out at least 65 defendants who are awaiting trial on felony charges involving violence, physical threats, or sex crimes. Similarly, in Indiana, of the roughly 1,000 defendants released on bail supplied by the Bail Project between 2019 and 2021, 24% had previously been charged with a crime of violence, and 35% were accused of felony charges and had a previous charge of at least one crime of violence. And because these funds are crowdsourced, there's no incentive for the defendant to show up for their court date, and many of them don't. According again to CNN, nearly 42% of roughly 500 defendants bailed out by the Minnesota Freedom Fund later failed to appear at one or more court hearings between 2001 and 2022. Commercial bail companies, by comparison, had a failure to appear rate of only 22% during that same period of time. This is why many states have begun regulating the use of charitable bail funds. Georgia, for example, limits the amount of cash bonds a charitable bail fund can pay in a given year. Indiana prohibits the use of charitable bail funds from posting bail for violent and felony offenders. Unfortunately, state-by-state patchwork probably will not solve this problem. That's why we're introducing the Keep Violent Offenders Off the Streets Act. The bill makes a small but important change to our criminal code to define bail bonds as an insurance product, thereby subjecting them to the same federal background check and regulatory requirement as those of for-profit bail agencies under the Federal Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1994. This change would also bring charitable bail funds under a state insurance regulation, giving states the ability to better scrutinize the use of these funds. Let me be clear, this bill does not outlaw the use of charitable bail funds, nor does it regulate the posting of cash bail by family and friends of the accused. This bill merely says if you are operating as a non-for-profit with the purpose of posting cash bail, you should be subject to the same regulation and oversight requirements as those operating as a for-profit entity. This will bring needed oversight to organizations that for years have gone unregulated while ensuring accountability of these funds by subjecting them to federal insurance fraud statutes if they misappropriate funds or misrepresent the use of these funds in any financial report. The bill is a step forward in reversing kind of the radical, what we know now are kind of left-wing bail policies like those that were promoted in Minnesota. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 8205, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 8205 is yet another vehicle for Republican campaign messaging that does nothing to help the American people. This bill, which would amend the federal insurance fraud statute to define, quote, the business of insurance, unquote, to include the posting of any kind of monetary bail, does nothing to address violent crime. It is simply another attempt by Republicans to claim that Democrats are soft on crime and to distract the American people from the indisputable fact that crime is down across the country and it has been for several years. Instead of leaving state interests to the states, this bill appears to target nonprofit bail funds that try to address the clear inequities that result when people without financial means are held pending trial, simply because they cannot afford to pay the bail amounts set by the court. Nonprofit bail funds, the Minnesota Freedom Fund in particular, have become a target of Republicans recently as they desperately tried to prop up their failing presidential candidate by attacking Vice President Harris and Governor Walz. Former President Trump has repeatedly and falsely claimed that Vice President Harris donated to the Minnesota Freedom Fund and that her donation secured the release of a man who went on to commit murder. This is nothing more than another made-up story the Republican ticket has created, and it is just as false as the former president's claim that immigrants are eating the dogs. The Minnesota Freedom Fund has confirmed that Vice President Harris has never donated to them and that her only relationship to the fund was a 2020 tweet encouraging people to, quote, chip in if they were able, 2 years before the result of the release of the individual who committed the murder that Republicans basically blame on Vice President Harris. And while the bill's sponsor claims that weak bail policies led to a tragic incident in Waukesha, Wisconsin, we know that the person's release in that case was not due to bail reform or any specific policy. Instead, it was the result of a mistake made by an inexperienced and overburdened assistant district attorney who erroneously asked for a bail amount, far below what her office's policies required at the time. Of course, this does not make the Waukesha murders any less tragic, but it demonstrates that Republicans are willing to politicize even the most heinous crimes to serve their desperate needs. We know from experience and from actual data that when you put the political rhetoric aside, Democratic policies work to reduce crime. Homicides are down across the country. Violent crimes are down. Property crimes are down. We learned just yesterday that even drug overdoses are down this year, substantially. And while my Republican colleagues love to criticize policies aimed at eliminating or reducing our justice system's reliance on cash bail, study after study, including a recent comprehensive study by the Brennan Center of 36 jurisdictions, shows that bail reform has not led to an increase in crime. The underlying premise of this bill, that bail policies have increased violent crime, is fatally flawed. But that is not the only problem with this legislation. Another problem is that the insurance fraud statute that this bill seeks to amend applies only to, quote, the business of insurance, unquote, that affects interstate commerce, which the posting of bail by a state or local bail fund does not do. The bill also applies to entities that post any bond, including non-criminal immigration bonds, which has nothing to do with violent crime. In fact, the provisions of this bill that actually attempted to address violent crime by allowing state and local jurisdictions to use burn JAG grants to develop public safety reports relating to each defendant charged with a violent offense has been stripped from the bill by the ANS. All that remains is the provision relating to insurance fraud. I challenge my Republican colleagues to explain how exactly subjecting state and local bail organizations to federal insurance regulations and federal criminal penalties will reduce violent crime, when the vast majority of the bonds they post are for nonviolent crime, and when these organizations are already regulated by their own states. I expect my Republican colleagues instead to spend their time this morning citing individual examples of people who committed violent offenses after being bailed out by nonprofit bail funds. Each is tragic, and our hearts go out to the victims and their families. But they won't tell you about the thousands more who received help from these funds, finished their cases, and moved on with their lives without incident. They won't tell you about people who commit crimes after being released with the help of commercial bail agents. And they will not tell you that it is a judge, not a bail fund, who decides whether to set cash bail on a given case, and if so, in what amount. Bail funds simply allow indigent defendants to obtain a release that a court has already deemed to be appropriate. We must remember that we cannot ask for or expect perfection from our bail system. What we can do is to make sure that the solutions we propose for violent crime are actually targeted to address the problem rather than to provide sound bites for social media. There is no question that we must address the root causes of violent crime, invest in proven solutions, such as community violence intervention and drug treatment, and we must also support law enforcement with funding and other resources rather than attacking the FBI, ATF, and our other federal partners relentlessly. Furthermore, if we are going to subject state and local bail organizations to federal regulation, we must do so only after a hearing to explore whether increased federal regulation of bail as insurance will advance our shared goal of keeping Americans safe. If and when the majority decides to get serious about combating violence in America, I will gladly join them in exploring serious solutions. But this legislation is no solution at all. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no on H.R. 8205. Thank you, and I yield back.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R.
Without
8205.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text. For the purposes of amendment, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin to explain the amendment.
Yeah, Chairman, this amendment strikes Section 2 of the bill. The amendment makes the bill more straightforward to ensure that corporate, nonprofit, and for-profit entities posting bail on behalf of someone else are subject to the same federal insurance laws that I spoke about earlier, and I would urge support for the amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to ask my colleague from Wisconsin some questions about what this legislation actually does with respect on two fronts. One is that at the federal level, the Bail Reform Act, which has been in place for 40 years now and withstood varieties of constitutional and judicial challenges, that governs bail at the federal level to the extent they still use it, because the act was aimed at avoiding cash bail and putting in place a series of other types of methods to ensure that a defendant would return to court. So I assume that this is not aimed at touching on federal bail. Is that fair?
No, it's simply, it just adds that federal crime statute dealing with the insurance-related crimes.
Okay. So then looking at 1033, which is the statute that you amend with your amendment here, your proposed amendment, you're amending a section where it defines the business of insurance. And in that definition that's related, it says the term insurer means any entity, the business activity of which is the writing of insurance or the reinsuring of risk, and includes any person who acts as or is an officer, director, agent, or employee of that business. Under your amendment, who would be the insurer?
At the time that we were writing the bill, I think what you could say is that there probably would be many different variations of whatever that insurance product could look like. So, you know, what I'm trying to do is that this would prohibit them, for example, from making kind of material false statements on any financial report. Maybe there's a misappropriations of these funds once the crowdsource is completed, or maybe misrepresenting the use of the funds.
Okay, but if we're gonna...
So if you got an insurance product, I think it could be it could
Okay,
vary. It could
okay,
vary.
but if we're gonna expose somebody to criminal liability, the statute, I think, needs to be very clear on who exactly would be facing criminal liability in the event that you think fraud takes place. So who would be exposed to criminal liability under your amendment?
Well, the presumption is not necessarily that there's anything wrong with the crowdsource. It would simply be that now, once again, there's some oversight over what that pot of money is doing, how it's functioning, and what it looks like.
This isn't
which
an
is the problem
oversight
we're trying to
statute.
get
This is a criminal liability statute. This isn't just oversight. And by the way, since this isn't aimed at federal bail, wouldn't the state insurance agencies be the ones who should be regulating a state bail bond determination under your logic?
No, I mean, I think that what we're expecting is that the type of oversight would be similar, but,
Similar to what?
well, from state to state. And that you would have a situation where if you had one source of oversight over these funds, that it may change. It may be different in Wisconsin than it would be in Maryland.
Okay, well, look, just let me be clear about this then, based on what I think you're saying. State to state, this is gonna have a different impact because some are gonna have state insurance, corporations, and some are not. State to state, you're gonna have judges who would be making bail decisions, who I think would be immune from being held criminally liable for a determination that they might make about whether bail should be granted. So certainly the judge can't be viewed as the insurer. And based on what I think you just said, we don't know who would be subject to criminal liability under your amendment to this provision, which I think is, to say the least, a very dangerous way to move forward. And I think when you have a criminal provision that's that vague, as we saw in McDonnell decision from the Supreme Court, if it's vague and it's criminal, it's inherently unconstitutional because you're not giving people who could be subject to criminal exposure the notice that they deserve before they commit any kind of act. I'm running out of time. I had other questions about interstate commerce issues as well, because the provision you're amending focuses on interstate commerce as opposed to intrastate commerce. So even if we assume this is commerce-driven, you're trying to regulate something that by definition is intrastate, and therefore, I think, would not be covered by the provision of 1033. But I've exhausted my time, but given the answers we just got, I think I'm compelled to vote against the amendment as it stands.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?